Hi, in this video demonstration we're going to take a look at a subtle effect that'll help add to the realism of our scenes in 3 dimensions called depth of field. This is something that occurs naturally in the world as far as our eyes and how they focus, as well as photographers and film camera operators understand this effect very well. As we focus our eyes on something in the real world, that object, that image becomes clearer, but anything farther back or further up close to our eyes tends to get blurry or out of focus. The effect happens naturally so well in the real world that when we see an image like a 3D rendered scene without this depth of field effect, it tends to look absolutely and completely fake. So what we're going to do is, you should have downloaded a file to follow along with this video demonstration called DOF_start, depth of field _start, and we're going to open up that file here and take a look here. What you're going to see when you open up this file is a series of teapots, cylinders, and spheres, all with some different kinds of textures on them and colors and stuff like that, going from close up to far away. You're also going to find a couple of lights in here just to make everything look a little nicer, as well as a camera. And this effect does not work without a camera because we need to control things on it like we would in the real world. The camera aperture and things like an f-stop, which are all photography terms we've kind of adopted here in the 3D world. In my perspective view here, I'm in perspective now, and if I go ahead and hit C, it should jump to the only camera in the scene. Camera 002, looks like I have this one named, where we've got kind of a nice view of this scene here. I'm going to go ahead and blow up my camera view here. And here our teapots sit with their friends here, and they're crisp and clear all the way back. There's a good reason for this. Everything in 3D is an illusion of three-dimensional space. If we think about this, the monitor that we're staring at is the exact same distance from our eyes, no matter which of these images that appear to be in three-dimensional space are farther or closer, right? The one up close is the exact same distance from my eyes as the teapot all the way in the back, which kind of cancels out that natural depth of field that we experience in the true three-dimensional real world. So in 3D, we have to fake it. We've got to create the illusion of depth of field by blurring things out in 3D space that are farther away or closer up than our actual focal point. To do this, we're going to need to select our camera. If you haven't already, go ahead to your select by name and select that camera 2 from the list. You may need to turn on the display cameras up here and say OK. And then move over to your Modify tab where you should have all of your camera settings. The normal ones like our lens and our depth or our field of view, which we can change. We've got some stock lenses here. If I just go ahead and hit 24mm, that kind of zeroes that out and makes it a nice even number while still keeping the proper field of view for our scene here. And then down as we go in our camera settings, we're going to end up here with a box of settings called the multipass effect. You should recognize what I was just talking about, depth of field, in the drop-down menu there. And what we're going to do is going to be changed here in the settings of the camera. First thing I want to do is go ahead and hit the checkbox that says Enable. And we're working in mental ray, so I'm going to change the drop-down from the regular traditional depth of field to depth of field with mental ray. It works a little bit more intuitively. It's a little bit easier to work around here. And immediately, you should probably see a preview effect in our viewport happening here. Right now, our focal point is the teapot that is perfectly up close, and as the farther they get away, they get blurrier. It might be even making your eyes water a little bit here. If it didn't kickstart the preview mode, you can always hit the button preview over here to kind of kick it into gear and hopefully get that started. But usually it kind of starts automatically for us. Below these settings, we've got 2 values that are going to be what we're going to use to actually control this effect. The first one is our target distance. Speaking of our camera's target and how far it is away. And the second is our f-stop number, which controls the virtual aperture of our camera. The higher this f-stop goes, the more subtle the blurring effect will get. And the lower the f-stop number goes, the more extreme that depth of field blur effect is going to get. In order to test this out, let's start with the f-stop number here. Right now, we're focused about the same length away as our teapot is here. If I take a look at my camera, the camera target is pretty much even with that first green teapot in our scene. So we'll start there. I need to go select my camera again since I unselected it. And we'll take a look at this f-stop number. If I increase this f-stop number, let's jump up to about 10, and then give it a moment to think about it. The blurring effect becomes so subtle that it's almost non-existent. In most scenes, this is exactly what we want. We want a very subtle effect. Now, the size of your scene will change this. Smaller scenes, macro scenes, things that we're making very small models in relation to our actual three-dimensional world, this effect is going to be a lot more extreme. Whereas, ours right now is a fairly decent size, probably a little bit average for a teapot scene here. And then as we get bigger, mountain ranges, stuff like that, the subtlety of the effect is going to be almost on the extreme side. Whereas the smaller things get, the depth of field gets blown out on the opposite end of that extreme side. This is why things in photography, if we take a look at macro photography, stuff like that, where you take photographers who are taking pictures of insect life or something. The insect themselves looks perfectly crisp and clear, but everything in the background and foreground gets just washed out with blur completely. Whereas, mountain ranges, the effect is almost non-existent to a degree that everything in the scene is looking pretty good, just a different size of what we're taking an image of. Ours is kind of in the middle here with our teapots and cylinders. So when I raise this f-stop to 10, we get a little bit of blurring effect, but it's almost non-existent. As I reduce that, say 6, we get more, 4, and more, 2, until we get into the extreme, and then 1, and suddenly things are getting blown out to a little bit ridiculous level, like 0.2, and then everything is completely ridiculously blown out, and we probably never want this level of depth of field in our scenes, but we can do it. So if I bump this back up to about 2, just so we can take a look here, and right now our focal point, which is our target distance, is set on the first teapot. If I increase this target distance, about 35 should get me to the next teapot. You'll notice that the blurring effect also takes place, showing up here on the teapot that's closest to me. Now the second teapot is nice, crisp, and clear, and the ones further back are, again, getting a little bit more blown out. Again, increase this maybe by 15 points to about 50, and now these two teapots are out of focus, but the third one is starting to get in focus. And the farther back we go, the closer, or the more subtle this effect becomes receding from us, and the more amazing it gets up front and up close to us. So let's take this idea here. Let's go with 35, making our secondary teapot nice and clear. This one up here a little bit blurry, and the one back here quite a bit blurry as well. If we reduce our f-stop number maybe 1.5, we can get an even more extreme effect here. And what I'm going to do is make sure that if I open up my material editor, you'll see I have a matte shadow reflection texture here to create that endless horizon, which we talked about in another lesson. I'm going to just kind of copy that gray color here. It's also in the background, so that'll work. And I'm going to open this up and make sure that I've got at 800 by 450 should be a good test for us. And I'm going to go ahead and hit render. One thing about Mental Ray's depth of field is that it will increase exponentially your render times based on how big the effect is. While you start to see that we're getting quite a good amount of blur here, but our render times really are going to get into the extreme levels here. You may also realize, if I zoom in a little bit here, that the blurring during the Mental Ray rendering effect is kind of speckled and not terribly wonderful. This is happening because our anti-aliasing settings need to be increased in order to smooth this stuff out.
I'm not going to wait for the entire render to get through rendering here, but we can take a look and we can see what has already rendered is a little bit, it looks almost a little bit hairy back here and speckled, but that blur effect is definitely taking place. If I hit cancel, and I can bump up my anti-aliasing settings here, or in my render setup over on the renderer tab, I can increase things like this. We can change our sampling mode to the recommended, the unified now, which is with our later versions of 3D Studio. And maybe I can increase the quality as well as maybe that maximum, minimum number 16 to maximum 128. Using filters like Mitchell always tend to work a little bit nicer. And then if I hit that render button again, we should start to see some of that speckled look get a little bit ironed out, smoothed over a little bit. Yeah, a little bit nicer there. But again, as we increase our anti-aliasing, it may increase the smoothness of our blurry effect here, but it's also going to exponentially raise that render time more and more and more and more and more and more and more. So eventually you're going to end up wasting a whole lot of time getting this very nice and yet very subtle effect. The more subtle, the better it looks in your renderings. It is worth the wait in most cases. But there's also another way I want to show you how to do this while we're talking about depth of field that might speed you up, especially if you're working with other programs, post-effect programs like After Effects, or for single images, Photoshop. We can render out what we call a Z-depth map to help us do this kind of depth of field effect in post-production rather than actual production, which tends to take an awfully long time for a minimal, great result. I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel here because we don't need to see the whole thing render out. Now what I'm going to do in order to do this secondary method, this is a good method. It will serve you well with a higher anti-aliasing and all that good stuff. We can see in our viewport immediately the effect makes things look pretty amazing in comparison to what we had done in the past. For right now, let's put this back up to about 2.0 here just to increase the subtlety of that effect. And I'm actually going to turn off that multi-pass effect on our camera completely so that we don't wait on that render that's going to happen over, a very long period of time. Where I am going to go to show you this next little method to trick it and do the Z-depth map depth of field post effects is my render setup. And on a tab that we haven't talked much about, we're going to go to the Render Elements tab. This is a tab that allows you to add extra render elements to your calculations. In other words, as we spit out the actual image, we render out the actual image of our colorful teapots here, we can add extra images or extra details here with this list. We've got the Add button here. I'm going to go ahead and click it. And all the way down to the bottom, we're going to use one called the Z-depth map. Which means it's going to render a second image out, a grayscale image of our scene, where white is everything that's up close, gray is right in the middle, and black recedes farther away. Now this Z-depth map here, I'm going to go ahead and say OK. It'll add it to the list. It says it is enabled and on. And down at the bottom, we'll get the Z-depth element parameters here. Right now it's set to a minimum of 100 and a maximum of 300. And it's always a good idea to probably test with defaults to see if that's going to work for your scene. So what we're going to do is go ahead and hit render, and we're going to let this thing render out our image completely. It'll take a little while because we do have some shiny reflective textures, as well as some pretty decent ambient and direct lighting in this scene. But we're going to end up getting two things. One, the actual image here of our teapots, crisp and clear from front to back, all the colors of the rainbow and everything for our final rendered image, which should look nice and fairly realistic all to itself, and we'll be able to save that image out to a specific location. And then once it's finished, it's going to calculate very quickly a secondary image called the Z-depth map. I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel here because I notice my anti-aliasing settings are
pretty extreme. Let's go back to our render setup here and go to our renderer tab, and let's just go ahead and put them back to kind of a normal level, quality of 0.25 and maximum minimum 1 to 128 before we go ahead and hit render. That way it'll take a little bit quicker. In the final version, you may want to raise those. Anyway, just to get rid of some of that pixelation or any jagged effects that are happening on your edges. Make it nice and crisp and clear. We'll let this thing render out, and when it's finished, you're going to see a secondary window pop up with another image in it, a grayscale image, black and white, which is going to be our Z-depth map. And we'll be able to save that out, as well as take a look and make sure that those initial settings, those default settings for the Z-depth map, are in fact what we want there. So we'll go ahead and we'll let this finish. Again, it's still taking a fair amount of time to render because of all of the shiny reflective textures and surfaces, as well as our pretty decent lighting setup here. But as it finishes, we'll notice that another image here, another window, is going to pop up here containing our Z depth map. This one's a little washed out, which means that I can tell you right away our settings need to be changed a little bit. When everything gets white, that means that we're going to get clarity for a lot of this stuff. We can change these settings. Go back to our render setup here in our render elements tab, back down to our Z depth. Based on a minimum and maximum, kind of thinking about what our target distance here is all about. Now, our target distance is about 35, so I may want to set my Z-depth minimum to something about maybe 15, a little bit less than that, and my maximum to something a little bit lower as well, maybe even around 100 there, to, let's try 150 just to be on the safe side. Now once this image has been rendered out, I can actually save this one. We'll call it our depth, oops, caps lock, depth test as a JPEG image. Say OK. And then I have to go through this whole process again. The second I hit the render button, it's going to render both the actual image here as well as our Z-depth map. But sometimes we can get around that by canceling out some of this stuff once we've got our actual image saved. Things like we can take our light and select those and get rid of the light. We can also maybe use an override material that's just kind of a flat gray at this point, where if I go to my processing tab, I can enable that override material here and just give them all a flat gray material in there, make it an instance. Which means that I haven't changed anything in my actual scene, but all the textures in the final render here should hopefully go a little bit quicker once I hit that render button now, because I don't need the actual diffuse image. Now it's speeding around here, and it should get us our Z-depth map rather quickly here. This is much better. We're getting there at least anyway. Now we've got this bright white, the one up close, this nice middle gray here, and it's getting darker as it recedes there. I may still want to come into my render element settings and adjust this a little bit more, maybe even drop that maximum down to 100, and maybe even bump my minimum up to about 20 or so, and we can try that again. With this override material and no lights in the scene, it goes very, very quickly, and we can spit out that Z-depth map that starts to look a little bit better. Now we've got a nice grayscale from white to dark here, and this one should work pretty well for us. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. I'm going to call it my Z-depth map here. Looks like I got a couple others in there. And just save it as a JPEG and go ahead and save that. Good. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to end up opening up Photoshop here. And inside Photoshop, I will open up both of those images. Let's go to our Module 6 folder here, where we've got our depth test as well as our Z-depth map that we just rendered out. And we'll open them up both. Two tabs here in Photoshop. Our depth test is our actual image, and our Z-depth map here is the Z-depth map that I rendered out. Obviously, we could up our anti-aliasing settings quite a bit to get rid of some of this pixelation and jagged, but for the demonstration purposes, this should work. What I'm going to do is, on my Z-depth map, I'm going to Control-A to select everything, and just Control-C to copy it to my clipboard. Over here on the depth test here, we're going to paste this image in here, but we've got to do it in one of the channels, not an actual layer here. So over to the side here, where we've got our layers and our channels here, I'm actually going to swap over from the Layers tab to the Channels here, and kind of increase, there we go, get this menu button to create a new channel. We can call it Alpha 1, we can call it Z-Depth, give it a name, and just say OK. And then on this channel layer here, we should be able to go ahead and Control-V to paste that Z-depth map image onto the channel. And then use it as a selection method here from the future here. You should see the thumbnail kind of pop up, look just like our Z-depth map. What we're going to do is hold down Control and click on that thumbnail to select via the channel information. In other words, based on this grayscale. Anything that's white is going to get selected perfectly, and anything that is gray to black is going to get selected steadily more transparent or a little bit less. Once we've done that, it's going to select this channel here. We've got to go back to the RGB channel. The selection should remain. Just click on that RGB so that it affects all of these other channels here. Move back over to our layer. And then we can go up to the filter menu, blur, and choose lens blur here. Lens blur is going to allow us to change some settings here based on that source. In this case, our Z-depth map. If I increase that blur focal distance, we're going to get a little bit more of that blurriness. And then if I increase the radius down here, we'll start to see that blur happen further away versus that kind of up close image there a little bit more. This is a matter of artistic taste here, however far you want to take it. If I increase that radius to about 10, it looks like our blur focus. If I go all the way to the far right, it's going to blur the front object. If I go all the way to the far back, it's going to blur the back object. So let's start with this one here up front. Go to 0. Increase the radius to 10. Some of these other settings you can play around with just to see what they do for you. But that right there gives us our depth of field, at least for the background here. We can go ahead and say OK. You'll notice that it does. It blurs it all out at farther away from us it gets. But we can actually come back in and do this once more. Filter, blur, lens blur. And this time move the focal distance all the way up to the front and get ourselves a little bit more blur up front there. So that we've got both the effects kind of working for us there. You'll notice that because of all that jaggedness of our render, the anti-aliasing was not turned up very well. That it's getting kind of jagged in here, and it's allowing our focus to be messed up a little bit. We can fix this. I'm going to go back and undo both of my lens blurs here. We still got our selection made. What we can do here is filter. Rather than filter, we'll come to our select menu, and we're going to modify, and we're going to feather it out a little bit, just by a few pixels. 5 pixels should work just fine. And that means it's going to kind of grab everything around the edges a little bit less exact. And kind of feather the edges out a little bit for us. So we can come up, filter, blur, lens blur. We can move this back again to the left-hand side on our blur focus, and we can increase this as we see fit, kind of here. Let's go with 12, and say OK. And then we can do the opposite: filter, blur, lens. Move that focal distance all the way up to the front maybe a little bit, and maybe blur it out a little bit less, just for a subtle sort of effect there, maybe about 4. And then our final image is got the depth of field in it that we're looking for. Granted, had we increased our anti-aliasing settings, some of this pixelation would not be happening, and we're going to definitely want to do that for any final renders in the future. But just like anything in Photoshop, you can always take maybe your blur tool and kind of soften those edges out and do a little bit of repair work post-op here. Okay? At least that gives you a couple of different ways to achieve the depth of field effect. The technically correct way would be using the depth of field on the camera in 3D Studio, but a lot of times we can achieve just as good a result, especially when we have to wait on a full-length animation to render, if we use a program like Photoshop here or After Effects to add the depth of field based on our Z depth map that we can kind of spit out as well. All right.